Okay, so over to Maita for you to start tonight's webinar.
So, welcome to my seminar on what seal vocal learning can teach us about human speech. I've run this before. I have a little bit more time this time, so I can run it a little bit more in depth and with more explanations. My name is Maite. I handle the entire catalog, as Sue said, but during my day to day, I am a master's degree student at the University of Turku doing a degree in human neuroscience. And originally, this seminar was done for a class, a pedagogy class where I had to teach, and this was the topic that I chose. So it has been reviewed by a speech language pathologist at my university called Henry Railo. So just to make sure that I haven't said anything completely out there, because I am not a speech language pathologist. I am a humble master's degree student. So
I just want to butt in there and say there's no such thing as a humble master's student. Don't do yourself down, please, Maita.
So, thank you. Today we're going to be covering a bunch of topics, and because we're going to be coming at a lot of stuff that maybe not everyone knows about, we're going to explain everything from the ground up. So, for starters, we're going to talk about what we mean when we say vocal learning, vocal processing, and vocal production learning. We're going to learn some terms when it comes to discussing vocal learning, and we're going to understand how to use these terms in this context. We're then going to understand why seals specifically are a useful model when it comes to looking at vocal learning in mammals and also potentially looking at speech learning in humans. So again, we're going to look at how seals specifically help us understand how maybe we developed speech as humans on our sort of evolutionary journey. And then we're going to look a little bit lastly at the seal brain and also the human brain and how parts of the brain help both seals and us produce speech and produce vocal learning essentially, or produce vocality. So we're going to start by explaining what we mean when we say seal, and specifically what we mean in this presentation. So when I say seal, what I mean when I say that. So we have a big old group of animals called Pinnipedia, and these are basically these guys, essentially a bag with flippers that swims. And there are three main families. There is here the walrus, Odobenidae. They're the ones with the tusks and the big moustache. They have these beady little eyes on the sides of their heads, and they are quite distinctive looking. There's only one species of them, so they all look like that. And we will not really be talking about these today, and we will only ever call them walruses when we refer to them. Up here, we have Otariidae, which is both fur seals, and sea lions. Here's the thing, I think fur seals should be called fur sea lions because they are just sea lions with fur. But for some reason, we named them fur seals, even though they all kind of belong in this family and look quite similar. So I will usually just be referring to these as sea lions and fur seals as a collective. And then down here we have Phocidae, which is the true seal, which is what I mean when I say seal. And they are the fat ones that blob around on their bellies. So more specifically, if we look at, oh, not this. If we look at seals and their grouping within sea lions and fur seals, essentially sea lions and fur seals, these guys, when you tell the difference between them, they are the ones that have these sort of rear flippers that they use as legs because these guys have a pelvis that is not fused to their spine in such a way that they can't rotate it. So they rotate it forwards underneath their body and they use their back legs as a sort of weird rear foot flipper when they're on land. So they kind of waddle on land. And they also have a different ear structure to true seals. So true seals have internal ears only. So they have a little ear hole and that's it. Meanwhile, us as humans, we have the internal ear structure and we also have the external ear structure. We have these earlobes. The sea lions and fur seals have also an external structure, but it's like a little cone. It's like a little spike. It's called a pinny. And it just kind of sticks out a little bit. So when you tell the difference between them, typically sea lions and fur seals, they have this little external ear structure and they have these rear flippers that they can use to waddle around on land. Meanwhile, true seals, or just seals as I'll be referring to them from now on, tend to move around on their bellies like caterpillars when they're on land. It's called glumphing, and they just kind of blob as best they can because they cannot rotate their pelvis forward. It's fused to their spine. They can't do it. And they also only have ear holes. They don't have an external ear structure. This graphic is taken from a YouTube video called How to Identify a Seal by William Bowen. It's a wonderful video. It's about half an hour long and it covers this a lot better than I can and quite in depth. And it also helps you tell the difference, for example, between a sea lion and a fur seal. So I do recommend that. So now we're going to do a little test where I'm going to put some animals up on screen, and either in the chat or in your mind, you can decide what animal this is, whether it's a fur seal, whether it's a sea lion, whether it's a seal or a walrus. So take your time to consider. Seeing a lot of correct answers coming in. So
People are being brave and outing themselves and putting it in
yes,
the chat, aren't they? Which is great. Well done.
outing themselves is correct, mind you. So yes, the first one is a sea lion. It is not a true seal. You can tell it's a sea lion because of its little ear spike that you can more or less see on the side of its face. And you can see a little bit of that pelvis tilt in the rear flippers. Not too much, but it's still there. And then the next one, this one is the walrus. You can tell because of the big mustache and the tusks. Most of them have that unless they're very young or very old. Sometimes old walruses will lose one of their tusks because they get sick. But usually they have at least one, and baby walruses tend to grow them relatively quickly. And the other two are seals. The ones at the top are Baikal seals, which are a species of seal that live in Lake Baikal, which is in Russia. They are the smallest seal species. They are also the longest living seal species. They can live up to 50 years old, more or less. And they are very amusing to me personally because they bicker a lot, as you can see in the picture. And then the other one below is a harbor seal, which is also known as the common seal, and it's just the poster boy for what a seal looks like, essentially. So then we're gonna look a little bit at seal vocality because seals make a lot of noises, and it depends a lot per species what noise they make. So even within one species of seal, they have a huge repertoire of noises they can make. There was a study recently, it came out like 2 weeks ago, where they looked at Hawaiian monk seals and they looked at the noises they make because above ground, they were thought to make, they have six noises, six distinct sounds that they make. And then they started recording them underwater and they came up with this paper where, hey, it turns out they have 25 unique sounds that they make instead. And some of them are done in very specific contexts. So, for example, they have a specific sound that they make when foraging, which is interesting to me that they even have a foraging noise. They can also do something that is so far unique among seals in terms of proving that seals can do this, where they are capable of chaining together sounds to make new, essentially combined sounds. So, based on context or whatever they wish to communicate, I'm assuming they can like splice these together essentially. And it turns out they just communicate a lot more underwater than we originally thought vocally to each other. And that's just Hawaiian monk seals. That is a just one species of seal, and they have their own unique noises. So now we're going to look at some other species that also have their own noises. So first we're going to look at the Weddell seal, because these guys, they live in Antarctica. They make a lot of very interesting sounds. And I actually have two Weddell seal videos here just because of the interesting sounds they make. So So Weddell seals and I think also bearded seals have been recorded making weird spaceship sounding noises like that. The thought is that maybe this travels better in ice since they both live in icy climates, but we're honestly not sure yet. But Weddles are also capable of many other sounds, so they also just kind of scream, and it's one of my favorite sounds that they make. So we're going to watch a Weddell seal complain, a juvenile Weddell seal complain about not wanting to get into the water. So Weddles have a very diverse repertoire of sounds they can make. Now we're going to look at an elephant seal because these guys also make very interesting sounds and it's a completely different gallery of sounds. Slightly less elegant. And then we have the final one, which is gray seals, which some people here might be more familiar. I don't know how far away the camera person was in that one. I believe they were probably a bit too close. I don't think you should be that close to an elephant seal. Um, but hey, the gray seals, most of you might be familiar with them, and they sound pretty great as well from afar, but they also have a different chorus of sounds they make. So So these are only a few species. There are a lot of species of seal, and they all make their own unique sounds, and they all have different levels of vocality that they employ. So, for example, ringed seals are quite quiet compared to these species that I've shown you, but there's more on that later because I've recently heard an adult ringed seal vocalize, which is something I hadn't heard before, and it's a unique case as far as I'm aware. Oh, apologies. I tried to turn it up as loud as I could, but it is a difficult one to hear. Okay, so vocal learning and vocal processing. So, what do we mean when we talk about this? When we talk about vocal learning, we refer specifically to the process through which any organism builds its vocal repertoire. So, what this means is any animal that communicates vocally, it is the process through which it learns to make those sounds. So this isn't just speech, this is, again, any vocal communication. So for us, in our case as humans, it is thought that this is what came before we developed speech, which makes sense because it's a more general, wide sort of term that can then be narrowed down into vocal learning and verbal learning specifically. But an interesting thing that kind of halts this idea that it was a precursor to human speech is that we don't really see vocal learning in non-human primates. For example, if we look at chimpanzees, a lot of chimpanzees mostly communicate with lip smacking and drumming. They don't really have a vocal library that they employ when they communicate with each other. So, how did we end up with it and they didn't? That's sort of one of the questions. So we've looked at other animals, and the problem is that when we look at good candidates for looking at vocal learning in animals, we don't have a huge selection to look at. Case in point, we have looked at it in songbirds because songbirds are very good at replicating noises and at making new noises. For example, you have parrots, they can replicate also just human speech and ringtones sometimes, songs, what have you. But this is a bird, not a mammal. So when we try to compare it to humans, it's a little bit harder because the anatomy is different, the brain is different. So what we want when we look at human speech evolution is we want to find an animal that we can translate over into that easily. And because we can't use chimpanzees and we can't use non-human primates because they're our closest relatives, and we also don't want to use songbirds because they're too far away from us on an evolutionary level, we look at mammals, and seals are one of the mammals that could potentially be used for this. They're one of the eligible mammals. So then we look at something a little bit more complicated, which is VPL, vocal production learning. And this is where we lose most of the mammal candidates that we could use as a model because vocal production learning is a little bit more sophisticated. It is basically an animal's ability to hear a new sound and then replicate it with their own mouths and bodies. So this is a sound that is not natural to the animal. So we as humans, we use this a lot when we learn new languages. Other animals don't use language the way that humans do, so they're not using it in that way. Very few animals have a need from like an evolutionary perspective to be able to hear a new sound and then copy it with their own mouths. Because again, this involves a lot of resources in the brain. It involves the ability to understand a sound, to understand the components that it's made of, and then to be able to move your physical vocal apparatus to copy that sound. So it's both motor and perceptive parts of the brain, it's cognition and motor. So because it involves so much work, not that many animals are adapted to do it. So very few. So we have humans, we do it, we learn languages. Bats can do it, elephants can do it, seals can do it, whales and dolphins can do it, and so can songbirds. So a much smaller category now. So when we look at VPL in seals, it's interesting to us for a number of reasons outside of just the inherent sort of situation that it is amazing that they have it in the first place, in my opinion. So, for example, we look at seals, they have their VPL, and we go, okay, can we look at seals VPL to understand how we may have developed it in our early days as, pre-language humans? We can also see, okay, why did we develop it? Why did seals develop it? Why did chimpanzees not develop it? Is it a convergent evolution thing? Did they develop it for independent reasons and us for our own? Or is there a common ancestor somewhere and maybe chimpanzees lost it along the way? Stuff like that, we do not know, and it would be interesting to know. So, again, can we use pinnipeds potentially or seals as a model when we look at the evolution of VPL? So, when we compare two things in not just in science, but in most cases, you kind of need to figure out if they're comparable. And with seals, we think they might be, but there's a few sort of things that we need to learn maybe or take into account about them before we can say, oh yeah, this is a good model that can be compared one-on-one to humans. So one is neuroanatomy. So are our brains similar enough that we can compare them? So this one is a bit difficult because, for example, when you get an MRI done, if you're doing an MRI for a study, you have to standardize that MRI to a sort of base human brain template because everyone's brains are very, very different. If you get your brain scanned, it looks very different to someone else's. So to compare two brains to each other, two human brains, you already have to do a huge sort of pre-processing, standardizing process to be able to compare them in a valid scientific manner. And being able to compare a completely different animal's brain to a human brain, I don't think we have a base template that we can use for that. I don't think there's like a pre-processing feature that we can use for that just yet. But it is one of those things where we would need to know more about the seal brain, and then we would need to find a valid way of comparing it structurally to a human brain. But then we also have to look at other things. For example, what is the social structure that seals have compared to the one that humans have? Why is our communication the way it is? And why is theirs maybe different based on that social structure? So, for example, humans, we're group animals, but seals less so. They come together sometimes during certain times of year, but for the most part, they kind of just do their own thing individually. So their communication will be different within that context. And then another thing is just looking at their habitat. We as humans only have to worry about our sound traveling through air. Seals have to worry about communicating both in air and in water. And it's been found that usually they have different sounds they use in either media depending on the situation. So again, we're not occupying the same environment, so the sounds we make and the context we make them in might also be different. So comparison, we need to work our way up to comparison. We can't just slap it out there and just do it. But at the end of the day, pinnipeds are still very vocally flexible, especially compared to, again, chimpanzees. And they're a lot taxonomically closer to us than humans. They use a larynx to produce noise the way we do. Birds have a different thing called a syrinx, which is how they sort of make their noise. And again, non-human primates have limited VPL. Meanwhile, us and seals have it a bit more advanced. So I'm not going to go through all of these, don't worry. But essentially, there are a lot of things that humans do that seals kind of have their own equivalent for. And we have some thoughts and maybe reasonings as to why they might do this from a vocal perspective. So for point D, with maternal interactions, seals have this very interesting thing they do. It's harbor seals specifically that have been looked at for this, where if a harbor seal is on the beach and it is surrounded by other harbor seal pups, I should say. So harbor seal pup on the beach, a lot of other harbor seal pups. Their moms are in the ocean getting food, doing their things. When the mom comes back up onto the beach, she needs to be able to find her pup so she can feed it. But finding your pup among a veritable ocean of similar looking seal pups is difficult. So the way in which like very, very young harbor seal pups make themselves more identifiable to their mothers is that they listen to the calls that the other pups around them are making, and they make a call that sounds different to it so that they sound unique among this group of animals, which is important for them. If their mom can't find them, they will die. So it's a survival adaptation. But it's also amazing that they have this ability to, for example, hear and modulate pitch when they're still essentially white coats. So very baby, very like a couple months at the very most, probably just 1 month to be honest. It's honestly, it fascinates me that they can do this, that they have the ability to do this at so young. Because, for example, humans, we're not very good at it until we're a bit older. Like when our parents talk to us as babies and we babble back to them, we're we're not we're not doing an excellent job at replicating sounds. It takes us a little bit longer to acquire language, and it probably takes us a bit longer to consciously modulate pitch as well. So that's one thing that seals are doing that is very unique when it comes to stuff like with sound and with pitch modulation. Another interesting thing is point D, which is the fact that seal vocality varies in a way that can be loosely compared to human dialects. So, for example, there's a study that they did with some harbor seal populations around Denmark and Sweden, where they looked at the sounds that were being made in these specific locations from year to year and found that they were different from each other in a way that could potentially constitute a dialect. But these, like, this has to be taken with a grain of salt because essentially they also varied from year to year in the same location, which probably means that either different seals are coming to these locations because they do move around, we know that, or it could also just be a case of because these calls are being done in response to what other seals are doing, they just change from year to year. But it is still a thought that people have had that, hey, they vary a little bit in the calls that they do, and there are differences between populations and between groups of seals in the types and categories of sounds that they do, which is also interesting. So no, I'm not going to go over all of these either, but essentially this paper, it's linked in the references, has a lot more of these instances where seals are doing things that can be compared to human vocality learning stuff. So then a point on seals and rhythmic evolution, because rhythmic evolution is a very interesting part of, for example, VPL. So with VPL, it is thought that when an animal or a human copies a sound they're unfamiliar with, one of the things that they look at first is the rhythm of it. So they're able to understand the rhythm of the noise they're hearing and they can replicate that. And that's sort of the first step of VPL. So animals that understand rhythm are interesting to us because it is thought that, again, that is an important thing in our speech learning and in our vocal learning. Another interesting thing is we as humans have music, which we think again came initially from this ability to understand rhythm and perceive rhythm. And now we've turned it into music because we can. But we're all like, okay, why do we have this? What is the point of rhythmic understanding, essentially? What is the point of rhythmic uh, understanding specifically in seals, but also in us as early humans? Again, the thought is it was a VPL thing. It helped us learn new sounds, and new sounds were beneficial to us, maybe because of language, maybe because of how we communicated. Again, social species. But maybe there were other reasons. So we turn to chimpanzees and we look at them because they understand rhythm. They actually don't understand it as well as sea lions do, but they do understand it. So we look at chimpanzees and we're like, okay, when do they use rhythm? And chimpanzees use rhythm usually to establish hierarchy, which makes sense. They are, again, social animals. A lot of the times they exist in family groups, and there's usually like a head male. So if they're doing it to establish, it's probably, again, they drum on trees, they drum like that to establish, who's biggest, who's strongest, who leads, and that sort of thing. And when we look at seals, they use it similarly, but not the same. So, for example, harbor seals, they have mating calls, and they usually use these, like male harbor seals will use the mating calls at the females while also slapping the water that they're in. So at the same time, they combine the sounds. And this is used again in like a sort of mate with me sign, but it's also used from male to male to tell them to go away. And it is also generally used, for example, seals will slap themselves to make a loud clapping sound that will warn other seals to stay away from them. It's sort of how they say, you're too close, go away. They don't want to start a fight about it, but they want to complain about it. And again, it's not necessarily a hierarchy thing, not always. Sometimes it really is just you are bothering me. But sometimes if it's a beach master and another seal comes up to challenge them, then it can be used in that case. And it kind of precludes fighting. So they don't have to fight. They can just do the slapping, they can do the posturing instead, which is beneficial to both of them because they don't get injured. So maybe they also use it to establish, again, some kind of hierarchy, some kind of I'm the main male on this beach. These females belong to me. You need to leave, stuff like that. But again, this is mostly, again, guesswork in the sense that they have other ways in which they can communicate this. It isn't just the slapping. So the slapping seems to be an option that they go for, again, depending on context. So they use a lot of the times the sound and the clapping at the same time. And a theory as to why they do this, or a theory as to why they needed to develop the ability to do this, is that these two sounds are very different, especially when you're underwater. So with gray seals, I can't remember how recently this was, but a while back there was a recording they made where they found out that gray seals clap underwater. Like they take their flippers and they just clap like this. And they took a video of it, and it is a loud clap. Like it sounds like a clap above water. I don't know how they do it, but because of the fact that they're doing all these sounds both in and out of water, the thought is, okay, what is the difference between a slap and just a yell or a roar? So a slap is louder, it will travel further, but it is very sudden and it is a very short sound. Meanwhile, a roar, you can make that as long as you want, but it's not going to be as loud as a clap. So if they compound the two, combine them, maybe it helps them be heard from a longer distance. Maybe it helps them sound louder and scarier. Maybe it prolongs the noise. It's just useful to see maybe what context they might be using this in. So all of this kind of boils down to saying, okay, so maybe human musicality came from very, very early territorial displays in our pre-human days. Maybe that's what we were using it for. But again, it's one of those things where we can only guess. Now we're going to talk about an aspect of speech that is very unique to humans, but can also be replicated by a few animals that are capable of VPL, like seals. So it's called formants. Formants are basically, they're very natural to us humans. We understand what a formant is like instinctively. So explaining it is always a little bit difficult, but essentially it is the frequency component of a sound that allows us to differentiate it from another sound. So for example, as humans, we can hear the difference between and ah because we can hear that that's clearly two different sounds. A lot of animals can't do this. A lot of animals cannot understand that there's a difference between those two sounds because they don't need to. We need to because we do language. And the fact that I'm saying different words one after the other right now and that you can understand them, that is a key sort of cornerstone of how language works. So as humans, it's crucial to us, but to most animals, they don't need it. But seals have been found that to be able to have an understanding of formants, they can hear them and they can replicate them, which again, very rare. As humans, we do it, but then not so much. So there was a study done recently-ish at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and they did it with juvenile grey seals, where they played them a series of formants, so a series of different vowel sounds in this specific scenario, and they play them to the seal, and then the seal was able to hear this, understand that these sounds were different, and then replicate them with their own mouths and their own vocal apparatus. And then just to make sure that we weren't seeing things that we wanted to see and weren't actually there, what people did was they cut the reference sound from the video and they just played the seal sound to someone who didn't know what the reference sound was, and they were able to identify correctly which sounds the seal was making. So they have this skill. What they're using it for, who knows, but they do have this skill. They also, interestingly enough, have a similar thing that we have when it comes to our memory. So for us, if you give us a string of numbers, there's a certain number of these that we can hold in our brain at once in our memory. If you set them to music, we can remember slightly more. If we set certain things to, or if we set a number of items to music, our memory catches onto that easier. And seals seem to have a similar thing because they play them some melodic sequences and they were able to remember longer sequences when they were melodic. I don't, again, not sure why that's useful to them, but it does, again, give a little bit of credence to the fact that they have a similar brain to us. So, formants in seals, it shows us the vocal flexibility of a songbird, but with the physical anatomy of a mammal without it being a human. So, again, potential bridge there between the studies we've done in birds and the studies we've done in primates. So again, the reason maybe why they have formants is because it might be useful in making these novel calls that makes their mom recognize them. We don't know if that's why they're doing it, but it makes sense because if all the pups around you are saying E, if you're the only pup going ah, your mom will find you because she'll be like, ah, I hear him. But again, we don't 100% know. This is mostly pulling from, for example, songbirds who do use it in this way, where baby birds will call for their parents in a specific way so that their parents can find them. So now we're going to listen to these seals. We're going to watch them do their formants because I think they are very fascinating. So this paper has a lot of other videos where they, for example, they've made them do melodies and see how well a seal can replicate melodies. And they're quite good at it, but they also have a sort of variation the way humans do, where, for example, some of us are a little bit more tone deaf than others. And it seems that seals have a similar thing where some are a little bit better at copying melodies than others. But essentially, those seals were doing formants. And a small note about these seals, because the way they took these videos for this paper is it was a choice because they make it look like the seal is being kept in jail. These were seals, I believe, from a zoo that were staying here temporarily for the purpose of this research. Their main pool was enormous. What they show you here is just a little training pool, which is like kind of off to the side. And the water is clean. It is filtered seawater, which looks a little bit nasty, but that is the nature of that kind of water. Just in case, because sometimes I show people these videos and they get worried for the animal, and I'm like, they're okay. They just took the video in a way that looks horrendous. So now we're going to talk about a very specific example of a talking seal, which is Hoover the seal. Now, Hoover he's a bit of a black box case in the sense that we can't really get anything new out of him because he is long dead. He was born, I think, in the late 70s, maybe 71, and he died somewhere in the 80s. So his entire lifespan didn't even overlap with mine. So we do not have a lot that we can really look at additionally to him. But we do know a little bit. So Hoover the seal, he was a harbor seal and he was rescued by humans when he was a pup. And this was America in the 70s, so you could kind of just do whatever. So the people that found him took him and they took him home and they raised him in their bathtub for 3 months, which I think that's a crime now, but back then it was fine. So they did this, and eventually, after these 3 months, he was getting larger and he was very hungry for fish. And he was consuming so much fish that they were getting in financial issues because they could not afford to keep up with his appetite. So eventually they were like, okay, we need to send him to a center, we need to send him to an aquarium. So they did, and that's where he lived for the rest of his life. And he had his enclosure, he lived with other harbor seals, he was having a nice time. But he was also a bit of a weirdo. So he was normal up until he reached maybe the age of 5, which is when harbor seals become sexually mature and begin doing their vocalizations, for example, at females for mating. And he began to do his vocalizations, but he did them in a strange way. So the story goes that apparently one of the staff members came in one evening after closing hours to clean around his pool. And while they were in there, they heard the voice of an adult man yelling at them. And they were like, it's past closing hours, no one should be here. But they heard the sound and they realized it was coming from Hoover's pool, from inside the pool, from Hoover himself. And they realized, oh, Hoover's the one making these noises. So somehow he was able to believably replicate a human man's voice. Actually, interestingly enough, he kept the accent of the man that raised him in the bathtub, which I think is amusing. Like he audibly kept it, which I thought was cute. So the interesting thing with Hoover is that he didn't seem to understand what he was saying. He just kind of made the sounds, but he would use them in a seal way. So, for example, he would use them towards female seals while blowing bubbles and slapping the water, so breeding song style, but he wouldn't ever like use them to talk to a human. So the thought is, okay, he didn't understand what he was saying, he was just able to copy these sounds. So we've analyzed his speech with spectrograms, and they are weirdly human-like for a harbor seal's speech. So we can say, okay, what Hoover was doing was weird. It wasn't just a thing that harbor seals can do that we didn't know about. And he was able to modulate his voice in a very similar way to the way we do when we make our different sounds. So formants, he was able to replicate those. Um, and while he is a very well sort of recorded version of this, one of the best ones of a mammal being able to make human sounds, at the end of the day, we cannot tell whether Hoover was making these sounds out of like literally hearing the new noise and creating new noises, or if he was hearing the sounds and then putting noises he already knew how to make in a specific order or in a certain combination that would then come out and sound like human noises. So we don't know if he was truly creating new sounds or if he was just very, very good at replicating them with what he already had. And unfortunately, we can't find out because he's long dead. So Hoover's performance specifically, he was able to modulate quite a bit. He was able to say, hello there, come over here, hurry, hey, hey, and Hoover. So these are probably things he heard when he was a pup growing up in the bathtub. So again, we do not know if he was stringing together his innate sounds, which is referred to as usage learning, so it comes from vocal learning, or if he was straight up doing VPL, creating these new sounds. But an interesting thing to note with all of these examples, with the gray seals from the St. Andrews paper, and also with Hoover, and also with the harbor seal pups that are able to modulate their voices as well, all of these animals have been looked at and have been doing this vocal learning and this potential VPL as pups or juveniles. So the gray seals, they were young, they were not fully grown. And an interesting thing with species that do vocal learning is that a lot of us have a period of time during which we are more sensitive to learning languages or to learning vocal stuff in general. And I mean, case in point with humans, for example, when I was a child, I grew up with more languages. So, for example, I grew up speaking three languages as a child, and I still speak them. It's all good. Now, as an adult, I'm trying to learn a fourth, and it is destroying me. It is so hard because I don't have that child brain anymore that is specifically adapted to learn all of those things. So, it takes a lot more time and effort now. So, it's interesting that seals also seem to have this sort of essentially more sensitive learning period as children or as juveniles, and then they mostly just utilize it when they're older, but they're not as elastic with learning it. That being said, we have not tested it in adult seals, probably because a lot of them are quite big, so it's kind of harder to do it for them. But we also just haven't because there's not that much research in this. So because we haven't looked at adult seals, we don't know if adult seals are good at it as much as their juvenile counterparts, or if they're worse. We do not know. But the thought is that they might be worse if it follows the way that we do it. So now we're going to listen to Hoover a little bit because there are recordings of him and I love him. And the other one. So that was the sound that would come from his pool while the keepers were just trying to do their job. So very interesting case. I wish so much that we could learn more about him, but we cannot. We'll probably just have to wait for another seal that can do that. But now we're going to look at the brain because the brain obviously plays a huge part in both our ability to understand speech and to then produce it ourselves. And when we look at the brain and when we look at human speech, it's an organ that it's kind of different to the study that we do of other organs. So when we look at the brain, for example, we've divided it into sections, but these are delineations that we have made as humans to help us study the brain. The brain itself is not like clear cut into these different sections that do different things. Multiple parts of the brain all over can contribute to one output or to one thing. So, for example, short term memory, it's going to be a bunch of things or a bunch of areas working together to allow you to remember things. So, we're still going to look at it in these sections because the sections are useful for learning, but it is also like it's not the most what's the word, strict science. It's not the most exact science. It's not like the heart where you can give numbers about output and beats per minute. For example, with the brain, we still don't know how does one measure a thought? How does one measure one thought? What number do we use? What unit do we use? So research with the brain is a little bit slower going because of that. But we're going to go over the main sections of the brain very briefly so that we know what we're on about. So the main lobes that we need to think about today are the frontal lobe, which is this one here, which is at the front, which makes sense, and the temporal lobe, which is this one down here. And the other two lobes, which we don't need to go into today, are the parietal lobe, which is this one up top, and the occipital lobe, which is this little guy down here. This cabbage-looking thing here, that's the cerebellum, which we will discuss briefly, and this is the brainstem, which we also don't really need to talk about today. So yeah, frontal, temporal, and cerebellum, those are the main things that we need to be aware of today when we look at the seal brain and the human brain. So the temporal lobe it's a it's a big area of the brain. So to be honest, it's associated with a lot of things. But typically in humans, it's associated with our intelligence, it's associated with speech, and it's associated with our ability to store memories. In mammals, it is thought to play a pretty big role in their hearing, and there are a few sort of key areas that we look at. So one area that we look at is called Vernix area. It's also known as Area 22, and it is found in the dominant hemisphere of the brain. Now, back into the entire topic of the fact that brains vary a lot, the dominant hemisphere of the brain varies per person. So most people, about 90% of us, our dominant hemisphere is the left. This is the left for me. I don't know if it shows up that way on the camera, but this is the left for me. Um, and then 10% of us, our dominant brain hemisphere is on the right. And that's where our vernix area is. So already it's not even that well defined. It depends on the individual. So we use this largely in our ability to comprehend language, both written and spoken. And it is very active when we're children while we're learning. Alongside another area, which is in the frontal cortex, which is also in the dominant hemisphere of the frontal cortex, which is also usually the left, which is called Broca's area. And this area is more focused, it's less on the understanding of speech and more on the production of it. So a common thing that happens is if someone has a stroke, a common sort of post-stroke symptom that they have is aphasia, which is the inability or difficulty with speaking or expressing themselves. So there's a lot of different types of aphasia depending on the type of brain damage that you got as a result of your stroke. And there's different severities. There's basically as many aphasias as there are stroke patients. So it's a very variable condition. But for example, two types of aphasia are largely referred to as, for example, vernix aphasia, which is the one where you struggle with the fact that your vernix area is damaged. So this means that you can express yourself just fine because your Broca's area is okay. But when people speak to you, you have trouble understanding. And then you have the reverse, which is Broca's aphasia, which is when you can understand what people are saying to you just fine, but you struggle to express yourself instead. And then there's also versions where both of them don't work. There's versions where they work, but something else doesn't work. But essentially, these are very crucial parts of the brain when it comes to your ability to understand and to speak. Then another part of the temporal lobe that helps with all of this stuff is the auditory cortex, which is located in the sylvian fissure, which is basically just one of the big crevices in your brain. And it's located on both hemispheres, and it just basically helps with your ability to process speech and to produce it as well. So it works in tandem with these other parts to do all of that. So just because one area is damaged doesn't mean that another area with neuroplasticity can't kind of try to take over its job a little bit. It's why you can recover from aphasia because you can have other parts of your brain kind of take over it or take over the bits that are damaged because the brain is very flexible in that way. So the seal temporal lobe, we don't super know what it looks like because we just haven't looked at it that much. There are very few studies on seal brains. For example, here I have the only MRI that's been performed on a seal brain as far as I'm aware. And I believe there's just honestly not very much else. We don't really have any in vivo seal brain things either. Like we have the MRI, but for example, we don't have fMRIs, we don't have EEGs, we don't have most measurements for seal brain. So there's a lot of things that we could potentially look into. But anyway, when we look at the temporal lobe in seals, it is well developed. That being said, that is a rare thing to find in non-primates. We have well-developed temporal lobes because we're smart, and chimpanzees also, for some reason, have very well-developed temporal lobes. Seals do too, and cetaceans do, so dolphins and whales. So when it comes to the temporal lobe, it's present both in species that use vocal learning and in ones that don't, like chimps. So we're not 100% sure how crucial the temporal lobe is to vocal learning or what it gives us specifically in vocal learning, because again, chimpanzees have it very large as well, very complex, and yet they're not using it for this, they're using it for other things. So the temporal lobe, it's in charge of a lot of different things. And because of that, we cannot say, yeah, the seal can do this because its temporal lobe is big. Maybe it has some role in it, but we can't just sort of one-to-one map that because it is not correct. So what we can learn from this is that our ability to vocal learn and our ability with vocal communication isn't just confined to the temporal lobe. There's other parts of the brain that are also in charge of that. So one thing that might help with this is literally just looking at more seal brains and maybe doing again an fMRI of the seal brain. Maybe even if we could PET scan a seal, that would be brilliant because we can see which part of the brain is lighting up when they're doing these things. So it's a thing to look at. But again, it's not very it's one of those areas of research where you don't really look at it all that much because it's not that crucial. It's not cancer research, which is usually the most funded one. Is it because of lack of research or difficulty with putting seals under anesthesia? I would say probably the difficulty of anesthesia in seals can contribute to the lack of research, I would say, because they're not an easy animal to study. Because I believe all of these brains were taken post-mortem. I do believe that an fMRI would be potentially, I mean, it could be attempted. I don't know how well it would go, but I don't know. I don't know. I feel like they're smart. Maybe we can train them. Who's to say? Um, but but I don't know. It's one of those things where maybe there's a way, and maybe in the future there'll be a way, and we can do it. But at least for now, because it's not like a very crucial topic to look at in terms of studying, it's just kind of like we don't need to look at this right now. It's interesting, but it's not going to save any lives. So unfortunately, it's a bit of a back burner subject, but it is interesting, and it would be interesting again to look at more seal brains and to get more descriptions of seal brains. So then we look at the cerebellum in seals because they have a very interesting cerebellum. So in general, the cerebellum is involved in cognition and language. Its main role is actually in motor learning. So when you are a I would say a child, but also just at any age, when you're learning a new skill, your cerebellum kicks in. So when you are writing as a child, if you have any samples of writing from when you were a child, your writing was not very good. It was it was difficult. It took you a while to write each letter. Maybe if you try to write with your non-dominant hand, you will get a similar output. So what the cerebellum does is every time you attempt an activity, it makes adjustments for the next time you do it so that you will do a better job. So the more you do something, the more your cerebellum makes these little adjustments until you're able to get it right every single time. And that is the main thing that the cerebellum does. But again, it has other stuff that it does too. So cognition and language. So again, motor learning, vocal learning, and cognition. So an interesting thing also is that when you damage the cerebellum, it affects speech. So we did an experiment with some songbirds where we had some with normal cerebellums, and then there were some with injured or damaged cerebellums. And the ones with damaged cerebellums struggled to produce song in the same way that the others did. They could, they just weren't very good at it. So this is from that previous MRI of a seal brain, and I just want to highlight how huge the cerebellum is on the seal because it's ridiculous. So this is the main brain. This is the cerebellum. This is enormous. Comparatively to the rest of the brain, it is huge. Ours is smaller on a comparative level to the rest of our brain. We have a little cerebellum compared to the rest of the brain. Theirs is huge. And I don't know what they're using it all for, but I don't know. I always find it interesting to look at the MRI and to see how different their brains are from ours. So the seal cerebellum, it's large, as you just saw, and it's complex. And when something is complex and has a lot of resources put into developing it on an evolutionary level, it is worth noting, okay, what benefit is this giving the animal? What is worth putting all these resources into it? So we look at other animals that have huge cerebellums. We have dogs, we have canines in general, we have us humans, of course, and we have dolphins. So dolphins use it for echolocation and for timing and processing, which makes sense because they use that to navigate. So with dolphins, we know why it's big. In seals, the thought is that it's probably to do with how they communicate with each other. But because we don't know very much about seal to seal communication, we don't really know exactly what it's giving them. We know that seal communication between seals is probably more complex because their cerebellum is so big, but we don't actually have enough like actual research in seal to seal communication because most of the things that you've seen so far are human to seal. So Again, general lack of research. But for example, we can look at other animals that use it and figure out maybe why seals could be using it. So we've looked at dogs, and dogs are not so easily translatable because dogs use it to process human speech, which makes sense. They've evolved alongside us, they are companion animals to us. So it makes sense that over time they have evolved to comprehend us to an extent. So dogs use it not to communicate with each other, not to communicate with other dogs, just to communicate with humans. So one thing that dogs can do is they can differentiate different human languages from each other. So if you speak to a dog in English and it recognizes English, if you start to speak to it in French, it will understand that a different language is being spoken and it will understand that it doesn't understand. Another thing that a dog can do is that it can detect speech compared to just random noises. So if a human speaks, it's basically able to be like, okay, this human is speaking. But if a human just makes random babbling noises, the dog is able to be like, oh, this isn't speech. This is something else. This is another noise. But again, not really useful in seals because seals aren't doing either of these things at all because they're not really interacting with humans and they don't have a long history of human interaction on that level. So we look at songbirds because they use it a little bit more the way we do. So again, if you injure the cerebellum, it affects their ability to produce song. It is used in the songs that they learn, and it is used in then the songs that they produce. So why do seals have a big cerebellum? They're not using it to communicate with us. So the thought is they're probably using it to communicate with each other. What are they communicating with each other? That we do not know. Because again, like with the recent Hawaiian monk seal research, we learned that they talk to each other a lot underwater. We did not know that beforehand. That was 2 weeks ago. We were like, oh, these guys actually talk a ton. So again, seal to seal communication, we know it's complicated. We know it's more complex than we currently have knowledge of, but we don't know anything beyond that. So that's probably what they're using their cerebellum for. And then we have one more structure we're going to look at, which is called the neocortex, which is exclusive to mammals. It is a six-layered cortex on the brain, and it is in charge of some more sort of higher processing capabilities. So we use it, and some mammals use it more, but more basal animals don't use it because there's no point. So, for example, birds don't have it because they're not mammals. But the interesting thing with birds is that they have a structure that kind of does what our neocortex does. It's called the avian pallium, and it's basically just their version, kind of a neocortex. But obviously, evolved sort of independently. But again, they have some similarities in the cognitive processes that they're both in charge of. So the neocortex does a lot of things because it's the cortex, it's a big old mantle. So it does a lot of stuff. In this particular example, we're going to be looking at its ability to help you understand language and in general with cognition. Because again, your primary auditory cortex is in your temporal lobe, your Broca's area is in the frontal lobe. Like all different parts of the brain, they're all working together to try to understand things. So it makes sense that you also have, the mantle on top of the brain doing that. So on an evolutionary level, the neocortex is quite new. So it's a new-ish structure in the brain. So it makes sense that a lot of animals don't have it. It makes sense that, mammals and a select sort of number of animals have it. And because it's new, one thing that you kind of have to think about when you look at not just the evolution of the brain, but the evolution of any animal's body is why were things or why were resources put into developing this? So, for example, some animals that have really large skeletons, why? Because making new bones, that is difficult. That takes resources. A lot of the times, if you have an animal whose energy is going into making new bones and an animal whose energy is going into, say, hunting, the animal that's doing the hunting and putting that energy into that animal is going to then survive, and the one who's building a big skeleton will not. So that will not exist. So usually when it's beneficial, these resources get put into this thing and we see it down the evolutionary line, to put it very simply. So in this case, with the neocortex, it is a large structure usually, because again, it's the cortex on the brain, it's a mantle, and it requires a large brain to support it. So at some point in the evolutionary process for mammals, we benefited from having this structure and from dedicating resources that we could have been using for anything else into this structure. So you have to ask yourself, why? What benefit do we get? So the thought is that the neocortex and the pressure that we have evolutionarily to have a big neocortex comes from the need we have to cooperate and compete with each other. So it is thought that it plays a role in our ability to control our social behaviors. So, for example, if you are queuing for something and someone cuts in line in front of you, you're able to not fly into a rage and murder the person, essentially. You're able to understand that that is not beneficial to you because you will go to jail. It's not worth it. It is just a queue, and so on and so forth. You're able to make that judgment and then to choose not to do that. Meanwhile, an animal without a neocortex may react more aggressively to an inconvenience like that because they're not able to control that because they don't have the neocortex. So again, this benefits us as humans because we are a species that communicates and talks and cooperates a lot. With seals, we think, hey, maybe this is because of the way they communicate with each other. Maybe it helps for them to know when to fight and when to just back down. Because again, an injured seal less likely to survive. If a seal realizes that a squabble, because they're both sleeping too close to each other, isn't worth a full-on fight or a wound, they will probably be like, okay, I'll just slap myself about it a little bit and then I will relax. So they're able to control that, and that's beneficial to them. So the thought is that that might be why their neocortex is so big. But again, we've looked at it very little. We know that its thickness is similar to that of humans, but the neocortex, because it's so big, it does vary in thickness depending on the area it's in. So that doesn't tell us a whole lot. Another interesting thing that we looked at was the expression of a specific gene, which we're going to talk about inside the cortex. It's called FOXP2, and it is interesting for a variety of reasons, also linked to speech. We also looked at pinniped brains, and they are quite convoluted compared to, for example, dog brains, polar bear brains, and sort of other, I guess, carnivore brains in general. So these things, gyri, subgyri, sulci, all that basically means is that they have very wrinkly brains. They have a lot of brain folds. And again, we don't know 100% why. We don't know why it's more complex than a dog brain, for example, but it is interesting to know that they have a big old brain surface area. So again, we could look at their cortex as a model for other mammalian cortices and how they handle vocal learning because it's such a robust, essentially, cortex and it's such a robust example of how it's used for vocal learning. So again, useful stuff. Not sure what we can do with it yet, but it is things that have been found. So now we're going to talk about FOXP2. We're done with the brain, no more brain. But we're going to talk about genes now, which might be worse for some of us. So FOXP2 is a gene, and like all genes, it's in charge of a lot of things. So a lot of the times with genes, like it isn't just this gene gives you blue eyes and nothing else. It's usually like there's numerous things that it's doing and taking control of, which is why when some genes get damaged, you can really just end up in some real trouble. And other times it's pretty much inconsequential. So FOXP2 is involved in motor learning, vocal learning, and spoken language. So similarly to the cerebellum, it's widely expressed in the brain and in the neocortex. So we looked at it, and one thing that we do to find out what different parts of the brain and body do is we do terrible things to mice. So we took some mice and we essentially knockout mice are mice whose genes have been damaged or essentially taken out so that we can see what happens when you don't have those genes. So we took mice that had two functional copies of FOXP2 and they were fine. They were normal. Then we got another set of mice. These guys were knockout mice with only one functional copy of FOXP2, and they were fine except for the fact that their vocalization was reduced. Then, lastly, we had knockout mice with zero functional copies of FOXP2, and the guess was, oh, they might not be able to communicate vocally at all. No, they died incredibly early because their lungs didn't develop properly. So another example of one gene being in charge of numerous things and us only finding out once we test it. So we look at this gene and we're like, okay, let's see what other animals have it. Let's see who else is using it. So we looked at it in chimpanzees, and chimpanzees have it, but it has a different structure than it does to us. And when it comes to microbiology, when something's structure has changed, its its function changes too, um, because of again how things interact with each other on a molecular level. The structure of, say, a protein is incredibly important to how it functions, and it's very important that the protein looks exactly the way it does to be able to function correctly. So when the structure changes, the function changes. So they have it, but it might be doing something completely different for them than it does for us or than it did for those mice. So it's thought that, okay, maybe because their FOXP2 is different, this could be one of the reasons why chimpanzees don't have the same vocal abilities we do, because they're just missing the gene that does it. We don't know why they would be missing the gene that does it, but the fact that it's different might be enough. But again, it would be one reason among many potential ones. And in seals, we don't know what their FOXP2 looks like structurally, but we do know that gray seals and elephant seals definitely have it in their brains. I would guess that other species probably also have it by that logic. But all we can say is, yes, seals have this. It might affect their speech abilities in the way that it affects ours, or their vocal abilities in the way it affects ours, but they might not. It might not. It might not. That's the other thing. So yeah, it might or it might not, but we can say that it could until we can then definitively prove it at some point. And lastly, we're going to go over the physical anatomy of seal speech and how it is especially suited as a model for human speech and also just for making sound. So even among pinnipeds, seals have a very unique throat and a very unique structure internally. So harbor seals specifically, their vocal folds are angled. So say this is the vocal fold and this is the tracheal airflow. Essentially, ours as humans, we have it at a 90-degree angle. So our vocal folds are perpendicular to the air coming through our trachea. In harbor seals, it's a 76-degree angle, so it's like a little bit smaller, but not that different. When you look at sea lions, theirs is way smaller. Theirs is very, very small. So harbor seals are very close, even among seals, to our physical anatomy when it comes to comparative biology. So another thing that we could look at is how does this difference affect their ability to control and produce sound? Because it's I would say it's a pretty big difference, and these two animals, for example, make very different sounds to each other. So it would be worth looking at. Another thing with seals is not only, well, with harbor seals, is not only do they have this anatomy that's very close to ours, but they also have very good control of their breathing, which makes sense because that's kind of their whole thing when they go underwater. And they also have very good control over their larynx. And these three things combined make them very, very good at looking at as a model. These three things combined, a lot of animals don't have it. A lot of animals do not have these three things. For example, apes have anatomy very similar to ours. They have the suitable anatomy, but when it comes to the control of their larynx and their vocal tract, they just don't have that control. So they are not able to do all these things at once. Harbor seals can, again, from 3 weeks of age, they're the ones who are able to modulate the pitches of their voice. They can copy melodies, they can copy formants, they can make their own based on things they hear. So it's one of those things where when we're looking at a model that is close to humans and can do all the things humans can, harbor seals are pretty much one of the better ones up there, even just among pinnipeds. So when it comes to future research, because there's always room, it would be interesting to see if seals can learn things in adulthood. Because all of the studies we've done so far and all of the case studies that we've seen so far have been of juvenile seals or of pups. And it would be interesting to see how adult seals fare when it comes to their ability to learn any kind of vocalization. Another thing is, can seals learn vocalizations from each other? Because so far they've been learning them from humans. And so the last time I gave this presentation, this was not the case, but since then, there have been these seals. They are two-ringed seals. They live in Hokkaido in Japan in like a rehab aquarium center called Dokari Center. And they are, one of them is a rescue. Mashido is a rescue. He was rescued as a juvenile male and he's still young. And the second one, Suki, she was born at the center and she's also quite young. She's like maybe 6 months old at this point. And the interesting thing is that this species of seal is usually not very vocal. Like they will be vocal as pups because pretty much all seal species are vocal as pups. and then they kind of just go silent once they sort of stop relying on their mothers. And the most I've ever heard them do up until this point is grunt a little bit in irritation. But Suki did not shut up ever. She just kept yelling. So even now, she makes like this weird mooing sound, and she is loud. Like if they sometimes when like the account that represents them online takes a video of like any other seal there, you can hear her screaming in the background because of how loud she is. And she still hasn't stopped. She's way past the age where I've seen any ring seal like continue to vocalize, and she just keeps going. And another interesting thing with her is that Mashiro, when he first arrived, he was quiet because he was already past the age of vocalizing. But now he seems to have started vocalizing again, kind of in a similar way to her. And I don't know why, because he has no need to. So both of them now kind of spend their time yelling. So maybe, I don't know if he learned the vocalizations from Tsuki specifically, or if he just learned the habit of vocalizing from her. But either way, like maybe they can learn it from each other. They can at least learn the habit from each other, it seems. Another thing that would be interesting to look at would be their ability to rhythmically vocalize, because we've looked at them being able to understand rhythm, but can they produce rhythm of their own? We could look at that. And in general, I think it would be very great if we could look at more seal brains, because we only have the one MRI. We only have like a few descriptions of seal brains. We only have one when it comes to their sort of vocal learning ability. And it's mostly just gray seals with maybe like one harbor seal brain. So it would be great if we could get more comprehensive models of seal brains and understand how we can compare them to humans, if we can compare them to humans. So, and then here are all the papers and resources in case you want to check any of them. And that has been the bulk of the talk. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And thank you for listening.
Oh, Mater, that was wonderful. Plenty of detail, just really fascinating. I still feel like I need to listen 5 more times so that I can actually start to take the majority of it in, but really, really fascinating. Can we give Mater a quick round of applause, even if it's virtual and she can't or he can't hear it? Yay, yay. Okay, that's fantastic. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat, Mater.
Mhm.
Yeah, we got some reactions as well. That's fantastic, isn't it? Might dialect from Peter, might that affect where rescue harbour seals should be released?
Interesting. I,
Interesting question. That's what I thought.
I feel like it could, because currently, as far as I'm aware, in that area, like for example, the rescue center in the Netherlands, I believe they released them as close to where they collected them as possible. So they're already kind of trying to do that, but I feel like it could. But again, because they're able to learn and they're still young, a lot of the times when they're released, it might not be like a huge factor in where they get released. But I think in general where they're released is probably quite important. And usually again they try to release them where they've picked them up. But yeah, that could be interesting actually if we could like figure out where they're from essentially with dialect alone.
That would be really interesting, wouldn't it? And then linked to that, Alvin has asked, is dialect a drive for subspecies development? And is that the current belief is that dialect or language is learnt from mother or from nearby other members of the colony when it's young? Two questions, really.
So for dialect with subspecies development, I'm not sure because so far the subspecies of seal that we have seem to just be separated by space. And that seems to be how the subspecies developed. So, because currently, like for example, when they're looking at dialects and harbor seals, they are all harbor seals belonging to different populations, but still the same species. But for example, with ringed seals, there's a lot of subspecies. We actually discovered a new one like a year ago in Greenland or something. So I don't know if it is a drive for subspecies development so much as geography is, but I'm not saying it isn't because it could be. Who's to say? And is the current belief that dialectical language learned from others or from yeah, it is that is the thought that they learn it while they're young, so they mostly learn it from their mom and the seals around them. But the thought is also that they are smart enough to, as they grow up, adapt based on what they can hear. So again, but with the dialect thing, it isn't super clear if they have like a static dialect specific to a population or if their dialects are more just stratified by time. So this year, this is the dialect of this rookery. Next year, it's going to be different. We're not 100% sure because there's differences in both degrees. So I would say that they learn their vocalizations from the moms and the pups around them, but I think over life, they also just kind of learn them as they go. So maybe.
Quite interesting, isn't it? Because I spent most of my early years up in the Midlands, not far from Birmingham, and I moved to Cornwall when I don't know, yeah, 91. I moved to Cornwall, and my accent has changed subtly, probably not heaps, but it has changed subtly as a result of that. And I even get accused of sounding very Cornish sometimes, which frankly is really hard to believe. So I guess with humans that happens too. Most of it's developed to start with, but it can change over time, can't it? There's another question. Is it possible? It's about, uh, I think it was Suki. Is it possible that Suki wasn't separated from her mother like baby seals usually are, that she ended up shouting all the time? Why do you think she shouts all the time? And is she shouting? I mean, that's another question, isn't it?
I mean, so the interesting thing is Tsuki was not separated from her mom. Her mom raised her in the aquarium until she kind of just was like, okay, this isn't my problem anymore. And they just live together now and like they don't really have a mother-daughter like dynamic anymore. And she was very loud back then too. But I have seen other seals raised in a similar way by centers. For example, there was Mizore from Osaka Aquarium, also in Japan, who he was raised by humans who spoke to him, and he was very quiet all the time. Even as a puppy, he was quite quiet. So I don't know maybe if that affected it. There's also Nico from Doba Aquarium, also in Japan. They have a lot of seals there who was also raised as a baby and was put with the other seals as a baby. And he's also quite quiet. Like he vocalized a little bit as a pup. He would like whine, but never to the level that Tsuki does. And I'm trying to think of other seals that were raised in aquariums that were with their moms, and most of them seem to have been relatively normal as far as vocalization goes. And when I say that Suki is screaming, it's just that she's loud. I think she just makes noises. I don't think she's in distress or anything. She's just loud. Sometimes if the keeper is feeding another seal, she starts like whining because she wants the fish instead. But I think
Yeah.
she's just the way she is.
I was really interested in that observation about mum and pup being still in the same um, place, but not acting like mum and pup. I've tried to do quite a lot with that with humans because my mum repeatedly, even in her 70s, was treating me like a child. So in the end, I stopped calling her mum and I started calling her Betty, and she started treating me much more like an adult. It was really quite interesting. So yeah, we could potentially learn a lot. We have had an adult grey seal mum, and we know that her pup has been with her, but we haven't been able to observe any apparent recognition between the mum and pup, even though they've been lying nose to tail. But it doesn't mean they don't know that they're mum and pup. It may be just that their relationship has now changed and they have to treat each other as adults. My mum had a lot to learn.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think that they have very different relationships to familial stuff. Because, like, for us, like, I don't know, like, mom-daughter relationship is like a lifelong thing. For them, it seems to be like a month, and then it's just they don't care anymore.
Yeah,
So maybe it's not as sacred to them.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Any other questions? We're very happy. Oh, any advice on how volunteers should talk when caring for rescued seals, e.g., in the British Divers Marine Life Rescue Hospital and the Cornish Seal Sanctuary? How should we? Is there anything that we should be thinking about when we're talking to the seals? Should we be talking to seals? I guess it's a
Mm.
broad question.
I I wouldn't know because I've not been to either of these places because they're very far away from where I am. Uh,
Yet,
that is true.
one day.
I hope. So I don't know the normal amount of talking that goes on. I would say it's not damaging to talk to them, but I do think that the least amount of human contact and human association possible while they're there is a good idea. I know that again, the center in the Netherlands, Zeehond Centrum, they have a very sort of hands-off policy where they don't want the seal to associate them with food. So a lot of the times it's like feed them without them seeing where the fish is coming from. So ideally, the seal should be as little aware of a human as possible, even while being rehabbed, so that they can naturalize back to being in the wild as better as possible. But at the same time, I don't think it's like a tragedy or anything if they hear a little bit of human talking or if they even pick up some noises, because it's not going to mean anything to them in the long run, I don't think.
Do you think it could be reassuring though? Do you think our voices, even if we're not talking in words, do you think the sound of voices might be something that they could pick up on? Peter, you can unmute if you want to add anything.
Yeah, it's just I agree about them not being in contact with humans, but I'm just wondering, they're obviously listening to humans, and obviously we don't know what they're listening to and what effect that will have in the future.
I would say because they can't understand what's being said to them, I think like maybe the worst case scenario is they just learn some sounds that are not the most natural. Like I think it's probably okay that they hear humans and that they hear foreign sounds. Because like if they were at, for example, a rookery, they would still be hearing a bunch of sounds just from other seals. And if anything, it's probably good that they hear these sounds because again, it can help them make their own. But I don't think that it's going to damage them or anything.
Okay, that's super helpful. Thank you. Would anyone else like to unmute themselves and ask a question? Maita, could you stop sharing a minute? Because I'm just
Oh
going to
yeah,
present a few slides in a minute to finish off.
got you.
Anybody else want to unmute and ask? Okay, well, it looks like we're massively appreciative, Maita. That really was a fantastic presentation. And as you have said, you've changed it since the last time you presented this to everybody. So well done and thank you in that respect.
Thank you.
I was just going to finish off by showing you a few slides of additional resources that you might be interested in. Maita, could you just confirm if you can just see the screen rather than the next slide?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, so just for you to be aware that we do have lots of other talks on our YouTube channel. I particularly love this photo because everybody notices the seal in the foreground, but sometimes you miss the seal in the background. It's behind you is my favourite caption for that. One of the things that's on our YouTube channel is the Seal Alliance SharePoint session, which was around the UK summary of 2025 activity from certain areas. Anyway, it's not a complete regional summary, but this one might also be of interest if you weren't present at the time. We've got grey seal pup behaviour and development. Which was kind of 25 years of observing mums and pups and beach masters in the wild. But as you've probably been quite fascinated and stayed through quite a challenging and substantial presentation that's good for our brains because we've learned something new. One of the things that we're working on with Celtic Sea Power is a Seal Spy bit of kit, which is audio-visual kit to listen to seals and film them underwater. They're currently looking for volunteers to help train their convolution neural network to recognize seal vocalizations. So that just means that AI is going to tell you that it's a seal, but they need people to listen to 2 hours worth of seal vocalizations. And oh my God, they're beautiful. So if you feel like volunteering for that project, you don't have to be an expert in any way, shape or form. There is training materials there. You can just listen to bits and you draw a box around a bit that you think might be a seal vocalization, and then an expert will verify whether it was or not. It will just save the experts an awful lot of time if you're up for doing that over the Christmas holidays. Actually, Maita, there's another couple of comments in the chat that you might want to just have a look at. Sorry, that have just come in. And then really to just say to everybody, please remember that we're trying to be a self-funding charity so that we can remain independent and we can be sustainable and have some resilience. So our funding comes from donations, seal adoptions, fundraising, our online shop, and make big differences, legacies. The main thing that we generally sell, because we're a kind of charity where our only members are trustees, we don't have a membership scheme, but we have a Wild Seal supporter and adoption pack where people can support us as an ongoing thing. But you get stuff back, like real stories about real seals in real time, which is amazing. We've got lots of lovely new stuff on our online shop, including this deep blue seal by a local artist. Zoe, who's on the call tonight, has designed some hoodies for us, which are absolutely beautiful. This is on the back, and there's a beautiful little seal on the front. She's also done this sweatshirt. I've ordered mine tonight, but you can see I've actually got a very similar t-shirt. This one is Wings and her pup Jet. So there are stories behind the seals that are on the t-shirts or on the sweatshirts. Some of them are on our website and some of them are on the T-Mill site, which is an external provider. And then if you love seal pups as much as I do, but are interested in sharing how challenging the world is for them, then this book's great, written by Rob Wells. Carol Ann Lee is posing there with a book so you can see how large it is. And it's a pup who goes through 9 lives and comes out with a feel-good, happy ending. But another artist and her mother have written this story and illustrated it for us. It's a Flying Rings campaign book, but it's just a beautiful story for youngsters. If they learn at 6-year-olds, that flying rings are dangerous to seals, they'll probably never buy one throughout their life. And then we do have lots of wonderful things on the shop, all of which are supporting local makers, very little plastic, if any plastic involved in them at all. But I'm particularly pleased about this one that I've just put in here that you can perhaps see just covering up the puffin socks. These are absolutely drop dead gorgeous. Limited edition, 8 of them in the world, sculptures about seals on a Cornish beach, produced by Peter Welsh. He's hand painted every single stone on the, oh yeah, we won't show you, but it's hand painted every single stone on the beach. So they're very expensive, whereas everything else is much more affordable. And, you know, this talk is free. Obviously, Maite has donated time to prepping and presenting the talk, which we hugely appreciate, Maite. You're an absolute star. But if you've enjoyed the talk and you feel like doing a donation, there's a QR code there that you can scan, or you can just go onto our website and there's a donate button up at the top. But you don't have to. The whole point is with us is we try and make everything free. And then anyone who wants it or who is interested gets it. But for those who can afford to support and donate, then we're always grateful to get that. I think that's it. Yes, it is. I will stop sharing. I hope you got that link. If not, go to our website and just have a look at the top for the donate button. So well done to the 27 of you who have hung on right to the bitter end. Are there any more questions or anything else you'd like to say before we finish? Shall we just say goodbye? I'm going to stop recording at the moment.